Welcome to A Case of the Mondays, a podcast by 3R Strategy where we talk about some of the most pressing issues facing HR professionals and business leaders. From fair treatment of employees to fostering transparency in the workplace, we'll explore how to create an environment where people don't just have to come to work, but want to. So, if you're feeling blue, tune in and join the conversation so you don't end up with a case of the Mondays.
Welcome back to another episode of A Case of the Mondays, a podcast by 3R Strategy, an independent reward consultancy where we help our clients attract and retain the best talent through pay transparency. My name is Ramiz Kaleem, your podcast host, and today my guest is Matt Brooks. Matt is an independent reward recruitment consultant with 20 years of experience working with senior reward professionals. He runs his own recruitment company, MBHRN. But I think what makes Matt different from a lot of other recruitment companies is that he made a career change from consultancy into recruitment. Matt started off as a consultant at PwC and then moved into recruitment, specializing in reward roles. So I'm excited to hear all about the world of recruitment and reward, and I'm sure we'll get lots of interesting insights. So welcome to the podcast, Matt.
Nice to see you. Thank you for the invite.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us. And I think the question that I had when we, when I first knew that you were going to be on the podcast was really around how you started your career, which was as a consultant at PwC. And I was reading that you worked within expatriate tax. Now, I actually also started my reward career in global mobility, and I looked at things like, the differences in cost of living around the world and how we adjust people's pay packages based on that differences in the cost of living and looking at other allowances. But when we had questions around tax, we always went to a specialist like PwC because it's a highly complex, a very technical area. And so how did you decide, or why did you decide to move from something that was so specialist, so technical, to move into recruitment, which is very much around people and building relationships?
I've never been asked that before. I ended up at PwC because I graduated and I didn't really know where I wanted to go. I knew it was actually PW at the time. I joined as the two firms merged. That dates it somewhat. And I was, I think rightly of the impression that a career that starts off at one of the big five, as was the big four, was a good solid starting point. And so I ended up in tax, but somewhat by accident, but joining a firm that I had a great deal of respect for and thought was a good platform. It took, so the role of an expat tax consultant, I think back then, and it has certainly changed since, but it was two parts. You were in a compliance arrangement where you were preparing tax returns for the people who were affected by the movement of moving internationally, and that was sort of a very large chunk of it. And then the other part was consulting to the companies that were moving these people around the world to try and design reward strategies that were tax efficient, social security conscious, and making sure that everyone got the best of both worlds, I guess. And that bit I really enjoyed. That bit was fun. The compliance side was less fun. And it was over time that I ended up finding I was spending more time having to do the compliance than the consulting. And I was just somewhat falling out of love with it all. And so at a point when I was feeling this isn't long term for me, I had a conversation in a pub, as often these things happened to me, certainly, with a friend of mine who was a recruiter, and his group of recruitment consultants, because the pub was between the PwC offices and their offices, and he was a mate of mine from university days. And one of his colleagues said to me something, or said to the assembled group, "Do you know any lawyers that want to become recruiters?" And I sort of laughed at him and I said, "Well, no one's going to give up a professional career like a lawyer and become one of you sharks." And it was it was tongue in cheek because I liked these guys and they were fun. But he then turned to me and he said, we're all qualified. I was at the bar for 3 years and this guy worked for, magic circle firms and went round a handful. And I thought this is a different perspective on what recruiters can be to what I understood them to be, because my experience up to then had not been overly positive. Been mainly meeting very competent salespeople. And that didn't really sing to what I wanted to hear, I guess, which was, can someone actually help me navigate a career and where can I go and what does that mean if I make these moves? So when he told me that, I thought, well, actually, I'm not happy where I am. I need a change. There was very little point in my mind of bouncing around the other big four as we were by that point, because the role had to be very, very similar from my perspective. So I was looking for a change, and I turned on to this guy and said, I think I could do that. And actually, bizarrely, was offering my services up as a legal recruiter, which was bizarre because the company I joined had a legal and HR and a tax arm. During the last year or so that I was at PwC, or last 2 years, I studied a postgrad diploma in HR management at Manchester University, or Manchester Business School. And that had shown me the little bit of reward that I was doing in the really technical expat way was part of a much broader skill set within that HR field. And I had imagined that's where I was going. But there was no one out there doing what I do now to sort of handhold me through that and move me into the in-house world and, turn me into a reward director of the future. But when the recruitment opportunity turned up and I discovered these people who I thought were fairly decent individuals who were not this sales-oriented approach, I said, let's try it. There was a little bit of what have I got to lose, and it was fun. I mean, I'm naturally nosy, so it's quite nice hearing what people are thinking, yeah, it was a bit of a leap of faith. It was moving to work with people who I knew and somewhat naturally respected, and being able to talk about something I understood but not actually do it was not upsetting and not fulfilling as you might imagine. I did spend the first couple of years recruiting, thinking, I could do that job, but I was filling for others, and I was at points tempted to sort of put my hand up, but actually I enjoyed my side of it. So it was basically a chance meeting and a chance conversation, and someone who said, I think you might be able to do this, coupled with nobody, as far as we knew, globally was focused in an HR recruitment firm on bringing reward people in, because reward was difficult to recruit if you weren't knowledgeable of the topic.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to recruit, but I also think that, and this is a frustration that I think a lot of people have with the recruitment industry is, like you said, they can be competent sales roles. And recruitment is such a critical part of HR. We're bringing in the talent that we need to grow as a company. And I think when it comes to really technical areas such as reward, as a recruiter, you should really have knowledge of some of those concepts that are critical to the organization that's recruiting. So do they really want somebody with a strong job evaluation background, or are they looking for some global mobility experience or salary surveys? And I think as a recruiter, that's really where you can add value. Otherwise, it's just a role that requires relationship building and sales.
If in that second version, algorithms can answer those questions. And if that worked, then my industry would have been destroyed the moment LinkedIn picked up. But good recruitment is about, it's not challenging and upsetting the status quo, but it's talking to the hiring manager to say, do you actually know what you really want? You've given me a few lines, but those are generic lines you see on every job spec. Let's talk about you and your business and where you're going. And it's the same on the other side, speaking to candidates, to say, to challenge their prejudices, to challenge what they think is expected of them. So actually, you don't have to do this. This isn't a linear career necessarily. You don't have to go up from this role to this role to this role. I have lots of conversations with people who say, well, I've been at this company for 5 years, so I better move, shouldn't I? And I'm thinking, who's told you to do that? You've just described to me that you're blissfully happy, you love every part of your job, but someone thinks you have to move every 5 years or 3 years or 7 years, or you can't stay at a company for 20 years. So being a good recruiter is being knowledgeable enough to challenge what these things look like. And I think having technical understanding is a credibility that you can't get elsewhere. I don't think you have to have done the job to be a good recruiter. And I can point to people in my industry who haven't and are very capable recruitment consultants. But I think it helped me for sure, just to understand all of what you guys were saying to me when you were telling me what you did and didn't enjoy.
Yeah, and I think because you are working independently now, I think if you are from that, if you don't have that reward knowledge or background, I would think that it would be very difficult to work independently, because you need that support around you with that lack of knowledge around the specialism and the technical side. If you don't, or do you think that that's possible as an independent as well?
No, I would be stunned if you could go entirely independent without. Well, you have to have built a network and a reputation. This at the very bottom of this, it is a sales role, so you have to be at the table, and doing it as I do entirely on my own. I don't have anyone going out finding business for me, and I don't sort of pass off any of that work to other parts of my company. That I don't think would be possible if you hadn't built up a very strong reputation. But that's been done by me over 20 years, and I've always said that the guy that said to me you should be focusing on reward, a chap called Mark Brewer, who I owe a massive debt of gratitude to, basically passed me a golden egg at the time I joined him, and I haven't dropped it. I don't think there's been any genius in any of this, but once you've built up that length of service doing it well, you can then go it alone and do as I do, and to some degree ride the crest of the wave you've produced. It would be very difficult for someone to come in and sort of challenge in this space without any reward knowledge, because the candidate space isn't going to necessarily react well. And you're juggling two things as a recruiter. You're juggling the relationship with those that are hiring and those that are looking for a job. If you're a reward director with 25 years experience at the top end of the FTSE 100, you need to know that the consultant you're speaking to actually understands how your career has developed and what you might want to do, and what the difference is between working for, a Magic Circle law firm and a FTSE 100 and a US multinational. And if you haven't got that confidence, because you've got so many people desperately trying to get your attention, you won't react to anyone apart from those that you see are credible. So there's an element of longevity that's on my side. In the early days, it was the fact that I understood what an adjustable option scheme was, or how to spell LTIP, because that was an interesting mistake I saw once. But that disappears over time. You build a reputation, because now all those people I was talking to back in 2004-05 who were analysts and junior managers are now global heads of reward, and so they talk to me as a peer, I guess.
One of the things you mentioned that you said was a little frustrating is at PwC, or in your consultancy role, you were spending a lot more time on compliance than the other aspects that you enjoyed. And I think it's something that a lot of HR professionals can often be frustrated with, is the compliance and the policing element of the job. And I also think it's something a lot of reward professionals are increasingly getting frustrated with, is just the amount of time that takes place in, things like the annual budgeting and, the compliance around the reporting elements. And I'm seeing some people thinking about moving away from that as well, to a more consultancy role, because it's one of the reasons that I moved away, because I didn't want to spend half of my time looking at pay for the 10 people at the top of the organization while the other 5,000 were being neglected. And I think, are you seeing in the same way people looking to shift from an in-house towards a more consultancy role because of the frustrations they're getting with the compliance element?
There are certainly individuals that will do that, but I don't think you can generalize across a population. There's an element of the grass is greener, because there are the majority of people in a pure consultancy role who started off as you and I, or in those sort of specialist areas. What tends to happen is that their careers start off technically minded and being taught some really funky stuff, and then as they get better and better and bigger and more senior, they turn into sales roles that they don't enjoy, so they come in-house to get away from that. And then there are those on the in-house side who grow up from reward analyst and moving through, or coming in from a generalist background, however it might be, or sometimes coming in from marketing or someone completely different, who get to the point, depending on whether they're in certain industries that have deep regulatory requirements, or indeed they're in that sort of exec Remco space in the UK PLC, who go, as you say, I spend all my time doing one element of this and I want to do broader stuff. So they envisage that going over to the consultancy side is a more enjoyable part. You've also got those that go somewhat in between there, where they set themselves up as consultants looking to interim work, short-term contracts, where they feel that they can go into an organization, they don't get bogged down with everything else that's going on around, and they just deliver the project. But I don't think you could say this is a trend across everyone. Certain people at certain stages of their career, it's a risk to go interim if you've been permanent all your life, if you've still got a hefty mortgage to pay and other outgoings that you've committed to. Whereas if you're in a position where that isn't necessarily a problem, then you can take that risk and you can go and try and do that sort of portfolio thing. And if you're really able to take a big risk and you've got the courage to do it, you do what you did and try and build something from scratch. It's not. I don't think it's the case that I get many people coming up. Look, I'm fed up of writing a DRR and having to do all of the top level stuff, so I'm going to go and join the consultancies. I don't see that a great deal, but the frustration is there. What we are seeing is the use of technology to get rid of a lot of the base level admin. I mean, you take it back 20 odd years and it was a very different role you had, and a different team, and you had more people doing stuff that is now automated or becoming automated, which should leave more time for the consultancy style stuff at the top end. But it's not always, the businesses aren't always after new philosophies and strategies. They might talk about that, but actually what they really want is compliance. They want to make sure if we've got a FTSE 100 business, we are keeping the CEO's pay in line with what it should be. We do not want nasty headlines, while juggling the fact that we want to attract the best CEOs and the best CFOs, the best C-suite to the business. And that's your antagonism, right? Plus your shareholders, plus.
I think I guess they're also quite different skills, even within Reward, aren't they? Because I, for example, used to be a Reward business partner, and we found that was one of the hardest roles to recruit for, because Reward people in general are very technical, detailed, numbers driven, and have a combination of the two to be able to work with the business. Not everyone wanted to do it because they preferred to just focus on the tasks and work with spreadsheets. So what do you think are or what would you say and whether that's changed over the last 15 years, are some of those skills within Reward that you think are the hardest to recruit for, And if you were to recommend somebody starting out their reward career, are there particular areas that you would say, these are the things I think you should focus on because they're very hot skills in the market?
There's so many questions in there. So there are very obvious, clear technical skills that are phenomenally difficult to find in the market, usually very industry specific. And if you are good and strong in those spaces, you are always sought after. That doesn't necessarily mean that I would advise people to go and get those skills, because they might not enjoy it, and they might end up being pushed down into a siloed route where they get stuck, being paid very, very well, being sought after by a certain style of business forever, but not actually wanting to do it. And if you go too far down one of those cul-de-sacs, you can't come back out again without either taking a massive hit on your package or doing something dramatic. But if you want to stay working within the sort of investment management side of the world, and you've got strong carried interest and co-investment plan knowledge, you're not going to want for work. When I get instructed on those big asset management lead roles where carry and co is part of the remit, or indeed specialist carry roles within a team, I know I've got my work cut out. I also know then they really need me, and it's nice to know that, I know they can't do this themselves, and because I know it's going to be difficult for me. And that's one example of a really niche specialist skill, because that doesn't get seen outside of that industry or that setup. Knowledge around exec compensation is another one that sits right at the top of the tree, and perhaps that's one I would always urge people to build some exposure to. And what I mean by exec compensation is, because it's a broad church, what I'm talking about is being responsible for the RemCo, the agenda, the management of the relationships with the shareholders, with the proxy voters, writing DRRs. All of that eventually becomes the thing that the CPO or CHRO asks me for. So there are multiple CPOs, HRDs, and CHROs who come to me who say, you know what I want, can I have another one? I mean, they don't quite say it like that, but that's the conversation. And it's fundamentally, they're looking for somebody who can run that part of the process. That's the bit that scares them, I guess, or that is their focus. They're less interested, or they're less worried beyond that around other sort of industry exposures or other technical skills. So getting into that arena opens the door to the top job in the listed environment. And that's a frustration for lots of people who have come up the route of not being in the listed environment and not building that exact skill set. So the consultants that are in that space, I'm forever wanting to talk to, because eventually they, as I alluded to before, become told to be salespeople. That's when they quite often lose their interest in staying in that side, and then they're looking to come in-house. They don't struggle to find a role. So that's a really useful skill set to have. But again, it's not for everyone. As you suggested, you may well find yourself just looking after such a tiny percentage of the business that you don't really feel like you're having much impact on the rest, yeah. Or you're having to do something that you have to hold your nose to do because it feels unfair. But if you don't have that skill set, you're very unlikely to get into the very top role. And then theoretically, you do have control of everything. So it's potentially I was going to call it a necessary evil. That's an awful way to describe it. But it's potentially something that you do need.
But I agree with that, yeah.
In terms of, what are the skills that you need to be a good reward leader, manager even, it's definitely shifted over the years. When I started, I remember writing an article back in my early days of recruitment, which was about the reward person slowly coming from behind their computer, behind their Excel sheet, and actually standing up in front of people, and how it has evolved. And so we were talking about the evolution of the reward professional back then, certainly in the UK, which was, yes, you have to be technically minded. You have to enjoy numbers to some degree, but you don't have to be a complete spreadsheet jockey. You need to know what you're doing with it, but actually, I think you need to know that in every area of business, really, because you need to be able to back up what you're saying. Now, so if numbers is not your thing, reward isn't going to be your thing. But you don't need to be a maths and statistics graduate. I mean, I studied languages. I could translate tax returns better than I could prepare them. But you get to enjoy nothing better than a good working spreadsheet. If you don't have that in your vocabulary, then it's probably not for you. But you don't then need to be able to, compute Black-Scholes methodology in the back of your mind. It's not that. You have to. The greatest skill, I think, is around communication, around being able to understand these topics and then bring them to life to an audience that doesn't understand them, that might not even care, or at least doesn't think it cares, so that they can then embrace it, so that you can continue to do what you're trying to do with these strategies. So being capable of condensing complex ideas into relatively digestible presentation of some sort, whether that's a conversation at the water cooler or a proper death by PowerPoint. I think that's a vital part of it. 20 years ago, you could just get away with being a maths genius because you were passing this to somebody else who was the business partner. And then they would say something along the lines of, the reward guys tell us this is what we're going to do, sort of thing. Whereas now the reward guy steps out. The thing that you see more now that you never saw, or you barely ever saw back then, was the reward director moving into the CHRO role at some point. That was not a path that anyone had really beaten down. I'm sure there are people that will point to individuals that did manage it. Of course they did, but very, very few. So having that capability to talk to the business, which then means having more of an understanding than just reward. You have to understand what your effect is on the bottom line, which is why lots of people who come in from a sort of an accountancy background do very well in the reward space. Because a lot of the time what they're doing is asking the CFO to spend some money where the CFO doesn't want to spend money. And so they need to be able to talk to them. If you can talk their language as well as talk to the business, you're doing very well. It's a chameleon side of things. So that I think is the sort of the soft skill that all reward people need. From a technical side, things evolve all the time, so it changes. But at the base level, you don't need to. If someone runs a million miles when they see a calculator, probably not for them. But it's not the case of, as I say, it's not the statisticians and economists that are necessarily perfect at it. And before I go down another massive tangent, the actual skill sets within reward, which for me covers a vast array of, if we call it compensation and benefits or reward and benefits or whatever mix of various words, it covers a lot of different aspects than taking numbers and analysing them against other numbers. There's a lot more hearts and minds and ideas, particularly around the benefit side, of course.
Yeah, definitely. I do want to apologize to any listeners who are maybe lost in some of the technical language that we might be using, because I was smiling when you mentioned Black-Scholes and
and yes, I mean it's I can't do that. That's a complex mathematical equation for some other time, I imagine. Yes, correct me. I wouldn't consider myself deeply technical, but I guess because I talk to you lot all the time, we do gloss over these things.
Yes. So the other thing that I think is interesting is a little bit frustrating as well, because often and I don't know if you get that as a recruiter, but when speaking to organizations, maybe it's some sectors, but they are a little obsessed with, we need somebody who has industry experience. Now, I know you talked about asset management, financial services, where there are certain legal requirements, reporting requirements that they need for that sector. But for example, we work all the way from small charities to financial services, technology, life sciences, and a lot of those challenges from a reward perspective are very similar. So are there still a lot of companies asking you, we need somebody with industry experience? And if so, what is your response to them?
This has been a bugbear of mine since the moment I started recruiting. There are hundreds of people out there who have heard me say something along the lines of what I'm probably about to come out with. So industry-based recruitment is fundamentally flawed. I think it's wrong. I think it's potentially dangerous, because if all you do is repeat what the previous person did because you're indoctrinated in an industry-based approach, is you are in an echo chamber. It's a spiral down. I have been known to suggest that the financial crash of the 2008-9 years was potentially at the door of reward professionals. Now, I realise that's a massive leap.
It's a bit harsh.
Fairly harsh, doesn't stand up to much scrutiny. But I would suggest that 0.0001% of it was we were rewarding the behaviours of these people. I mean, we had Gordon Brown standing up in City at one point congratulating the behaviours which were being supported by the reward strategies, and we were just moving the same people around the banks. Well, if every bank is doing this and everyone's saying this is good, and then you've got the Prime Minister pretty much going, this works, it's no wonder we didn't quite notice what was going on. I realise that's ridiculous sort of projection, but if you don't mix minds up, if you don't bring some new thinking in, then you're never going to evolve. I mean, this is sort of Darwinian. So I always thought that when businesses say they must understand our industry, I think, well, they need to understand how they make money, but they don't have to have worked there already. But there are some elements. So we talk about FS, regulations in FS. Yes, they're idiosyncratic, but equally we learnt them. We learnt them after the crash. Everyone read them. We started off just hiring lawyers into reward roles because we thought that's the only way they can possibly get their heads around this. But now it's intrinsically part of the reward structure. And so I don't think it's necessary to hire someone who's got that industry experience, because we just hire someone who's capable of reading a few documents and adjusting the way they think. And actually, they ought to be capable of that because everyone else did it at that time. If you look at industry on its own, I think you're being far too narrow. I think you need to look at a variety of characteristics that define the business, and that will affect the general reward strategies that work. So a strategy that works to motivate people working for big pharma who are trying to cure cancer, their motivations are vastly different to people who are working in factories producing widgets, to the waiters in restaurants, and to bankers in big banks. They come from very different backgrounds. They're motivated by different things. They're therefore not going to be able to react, or won't react the same way to the same reward strategies. But that doesn't mean that the person that's defining those strategies can't get their head around that. But if you look at the populations, you look at the money they've got to spend, you look at the global footprint of the business, the ownership model, the age of the company, is it coming up to IPO? Has it been around since 1742? Vastly different requirements. Those are much more important than whether we're oil and gas, pharmaceuticals, FMCG, manufacturing, retail, or whatever. And so as long as the reward person can recognise, or isn't expecting to turn up from company A to go to company B in a different environment and go, we'll just put the same stuff in as we did here, and you would hope they're not going to do that, then why not address, or at least interview them and see how it works, see if they sound like they might work with us. And a really important point, especially as you get more senior, is that part of the fun of moving jobs is a new challenge.
Yeah.
If you're fed up with the job you're doing for whatever reason, and there could be multiple reasons, some of it very, very personal, some of it not so, going to your next competitor, whether that's a bigger or smaller version, you're not going to change a great deal. And the likelihood is those frustrations are going to resurface. But if I change your industry, if I change you into a totally different business, you've then got some time to get your head around that. That's exciting. That's the difference. That's one of the draws to it. rather than just getting, a carbon copy of the person that came before. And so you're more likely to attract curious minds. Otherwise, to some degree, we haven't touched on them. We probably shouldn't because I don't know enough about it, but AI would take over, if we're just going to do what we did last year. So I think that approach of opening up to other industries or different businesses is a really sensible one. The problem we've got, and it is still prevalent, it is still almost constantly talked to. I'm almost always told someone who's from our industry will work better. That is supported by human nature. It's supported by my industry. And those two things together are very powerful. So if you look at the majority of recruitment firms, they are arranged on industry verticals. And so when you're a candidate in your relatively junior age, you go to recruitment company A and say, this is what I do. I'd like a new job. You make some time to interview with this consultant, and at the end of it, you say, I know I'm in a hospitality business, but I'm really quite interested in manufacturing. They go, oh, well, that's great. I'll tell you what, you need to speap to my colleague who looks after hospitality. And so you arrange another meeting, and you say, oh, that's okay, fine, I'll do that. And then at the end of that, you say, yes, but and also tech and media has always been interesting. And they go, well, my other colleague looks after those. And after a while, you're going, how much time do you think I've got to interview with you guys? Forget it. Keep me in the industry I'm in, because I can't be bothered. I haven't got time. I mean, this was more problematic before video calls were a thing, because you were physically, how many dental appointments did you need in a week to go and see a recruiter? That's before you've even got a job to go for. So that didn't work. And then the other side of it is there's this human nature thing, which is somewhat protective by the hiring manager. The hiring manager says, I've got person from my industry and person from not in my industry. Everything else is equal. We like them both. They tick all the other boxes. So we're going to hire the one not from my industry, and it goes wrong. Their boss says, well, you're an idiot. Why didn't you hire the person that knew the industry? And they feel like a fool. Whereas if they hire the other person who is from industry and that goes wrong, their boss goes, oh, well, there's something wrong with that individual. It's not your fault. Yeah. You did what's right. And we just end up going, it's self-perpetuating. It is frustrating. And I should caveat all that. There are idiosyncrasies between industries. If you're in digital tech firms, your behaviors are different to if you're in a law firm. And somebody from a professional services environment might struggle to go into a manufacturing setup if they're not conscious of it. So it's not all utterly daft. But I do think people should be much more broad-minded, because back to my Darwinian comment, you want new ideas. They won't all work, but if you don't try them, you don't know.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of benefit in bringing those fresh ideas. And, I don't know if this is directly comparable, but we get similar frustrations where somebody will come to us and give us 5 company names and saying, oh, here are these companies. Can you help us benchmark against these 5 companies? And thinking, well,
but why?
Firstly, why do you want to just look at 5 companies? Is this the only place you recruit from? And secondly, are you happy for us to share your salaries with those 5? And they're like, well, obviously not. But then why would they give us their salaries to share with you? So it's I think it's sometimes it's really narrow thinking in terms of what they want to compare themselves with. And there are probably some sectors, I think, that are a bit more around we need sector specific experience, but hopefully the financial services example that you gave. So I worked in financial services, but obviously there is, at some point, you need to get your first job in that sector, don't you? So
that's true. But there's also financial services and there's financial services, the tier 1 banks versus small insurance businesses versus asset management organizations. They have different regulations they're dealing with and very different setups. So I do get candidates saying, I'm not interested in these industries. And some of them are for ethical reasons, and I fully understand that. But actually, when people tell me I'm not interested in FS, I think what they're usually alluding to is I don't want to work for a big bank where I'm hamstrung by regulations. So it's always a little bit about education around what do you mean by that? Why are you asking that? Have you even thought that through?
Yeah, I I actually had the opposite with when I left one of my jobs. It was only after 3 months because I hated it, and I went to a recruitment agency, and I actually said I don't want to work in the financial services sector.
Oh, really?
Any other sector, not financial services. But then they got in touch, and he said to me, "Look, you need to just go and meet this person because they had a reward, and it's not what you usually expect from financial services." So I then met up, and I ended up joining that company, and it's a FTSE 100 insurance, and I think it probably works the other way as well. As a candidate, you can have a perception of certain sectors, but there are some organizations that have a very different culture. You can have some really bad cultures in industries where you think, oh, they must be great to work in this.
Yeah.
And it goes the other way as well.
I think that's true. I think it's also true that your perception of an organization won't be the same as somebody else's. And I often find that I've got candidates saying, well, my old colleague from this business went to that organization and hated it, so I don't want to talk to them. And I've often found myself challenging them, saying, are you an absolute clone of this individual? And why not just have a conversation with them? Agreeing to interview with a business about a role is not agreeing to join the company. It's a two-way process. You're going in to interview them as much as they are you. Or at least you should be. And if you really push people and say, well, hang on, what actually happened to that other friend of yours? And would you have reacted exactly the same way? Answer, probably not. Culture is a major thing in recruitment. It's talked about all the time. It's on dodgy ground at the moment, because we've always talked about cultural fit, but that flies in the face of sort of inclusion and diversity, and so I think the narrative is struggling along there. But it was often the case that we're talking about: do you feel comfortable in this business? Are you going to work well with the way they work? And I'm not sure that a business can have a culture. I don't think it's possible that everyone in every department across a business, unless it's a business of one. I think my culture is fairly standard. I don't think unless someone's going to diagnose me with split personality, I think I'm fairly sort of doing the same thing. But I remember when my time at PwC, our team was focused on financial services, but also had a bit of telecoms for some reason. Never understood that. And then there were other teams doing exactly the same thing, but in different industry sectors. And there were teams doing different things on the same floor as us. So people in various other areas of the consulting space. We all worked slightly differently. I don't think there was ever what I would have recognized as a PwC culture, but people perceived there was from the outside. So I think this is one of my constant comments to my candidates is go along and see. As long as you've got the time to do it, you make the decision. I will guide as much as I can, but even if I've placed you 3 times, I don't know you that well that I know exactly how you're going to react under a certain impetus. So while culture is important, I think it's individual. I think it's perceived individually, and I think it changes as businesses move. It's related to people, not the name above the door.
Yeah, I guess it's that common phrase of when you say people don't leave a company, they leave their manager, and it works the other way as well, right? Because you're joining the culture that is probably going to be created by that manager and that team, which could be very different from another manager, another team just down the hall.
Yeah, and that those people change through promotions, through changes in the business. It's something to be always conscious of. It's something that I'm sort of asked to do. Find someone who's going to work well in this business. But that's, to me, that's a one-on-one relationship, as you rightly say. Yeah. People move. I mean, they move for many other reasons, but the number of times I've heard someone dancing around, not wanting to actually say it, and then eventually I've said, "Is it such and such?" They find it difficult with me usually because I know the such and such, and, these conversations are always, fully confidential. No, nothing ever gets outside of that, or else I'm finished.
There's something that you see on LinkedIn quite a bit. You see candidates complaining about, which is the length of the recruitment process, and they talk about how they've just finished their 6th interview and it's taken 6 weeks to go through this, and then finally after the 6th interview they've been told, oh, we don't think you're quite the fit for this. So what is your view on, and I'm guessing it probably varies by seniority or type of role, the ideal recruitment process? Is it 1 to 2 interviews? Do you think some roles do require 5 or 6 interviews, and a combination of interviews and other things such as tests that you would recommend? I guess more around reward, but in general as well.
So I guess this starts from the point that recruitment is a flawed process. Recruitment starts every time with individuals who are not happy, regardless of whether they're desperate for a job because they're struggling financially, or if they're just a little bit disenfranchised with their role, they're in a negative space. So you're dealing with people who are not skipping towards all of this all the time. It's always a little bit negative. I don't think there's a straight answer to what's the right way to do it. I think it's important to be transparent up front about what you're going to put these candidates through. If they know they've got 15 interviews ahead of them on day one, then they're fine with that, as long as those 15 interviews don't take 15 weeks. Years ago, I did quite a bit of work with Goldman Sachs, who were renowned for doing a very in-depth recruitment process. And I remember one occasion, someone sort of anecdotally telling me that he was asked in his interview, how many people have you met in this process? And he said 18, and she replied, you're doing well, I met 36. Now, at the time, there were people that sort of lambasted this approach as being slow and draconian, but actually what they were doing, and it worked really well, was onboarding people through the interview process. And when you walked through that door after that many interviews, you knew that everyone you've met had said yes, and you've met pretty much everyone that you're going to see in those first 6-7 months. And their retention rate after hiring was way beyond the industry averages. So it worked. And it only really worked because everyone knew that's what they were letting themselves into at the beginning. So we recruiters would say, look, this is going to be a long process, but there's good reason for it. And this is how it works. The bigger problem comes when you say, oh, it's only a 2-step process, and then you put in a third, because the person's going, well, hang on, there must be something wrong here. What has happened? You are in this sort of relatively negative mindset at the beginning. So you become slightly cynical, and you either stop trusting your recruiter who you're talking to, or worse still, you stop trusting the business you're potentially going to join. So if you don't clarify what you're going to go through, you can struggle if it drags on a bit. I don't think there's an optimum number. I think it's probably more than one. Candidates don't make a decision based on meeting one person and having one meeting, in the same way as businesses don't tend to hire people having seen one profile. So it's more than that. But if your team is small and you've met the whole team and you've met the senior stakeholders that you're going to deal with, then that's probably enough. But that could be 2 meetings, or that could be 4 or 5. The frustrations around recruitment, as I say, start from the fact that you come into it with a negative mentality or a negative scenario that you're in. And then if something like you allude to happens, I've done 6 interviews and now they've just rejected me for something they knew because it was already on my CV that I didn't have industry experience, for example. And I know that's infuriating. That's infuriating for us as recruiters. It's infuriating for the candidate. But actually what it is probably indicative of the fact that the real feedback, the real reason you didn't get it, is something they're not willing to share. If you've gone through 6 rounds of interviews, businesses are not wasting your time. They don't have the time to waste. They're not doing it for fun, but they've probably got another candidate and they're not so sure about that other candidate. And they're trying to split 2 very, very close matching individuals. And when it comes down to it, at the end of that discussion, they probably sat there internally and going, I just like her more than him.
Hmm.
And if that's the case, you're not going to go back to him and go, I just liked her more, because that's just not feedback you can accept. You can't back it up. It smacks of prejudice. It's probably open to all sorts of attack. So you don't say that. You come out with something fairly anodyne that says, the reason you're not there is that. And if it so happens that the person says, well, that was writ large on my CV from the moment they saw it, you say, well, I'm really sorry. I think it covers, it's an easier way to say no. The more litigious our industry or our world becomes, the more dangerous it is to say, we felt that this individual fitted our culture better. That's open to all sorts of trouble. So the feedback is not very sensible. Good, brutal, honest feedback is wonderful and is usually well received, but businesses quite often don't like giving it. So those LinkedIn rants that we see regularly are not a surprise, but I don't think it's necessarily based on the real facts behind it all. And to be honest, I mean, if I can be so bold, I would advise against people going off on rants on LinkedIn about things such as that, because it doesn't necessarily do anyone a lot of good. I think it's much more sensible to go back to your recruiter and say, look, come on, let's be honest here. What's actually happened? Tell me.
In your example, let's say that is the case, and they've come up with this reason of its industry, because they don't want to say something else. Would it not be, or is it not acceptable to say, look, it was down to the last two candidates, and you're great, good fit, but so is the other candidate. We just feel that this other candidate is slightly better. So it's not that there's something wrong with you. It's ultimately there's one role to fill, and this other person was slightly better. So it's not. Why don't we see more of that from organizations instead of trying to come up with an excuse?
I think you do see that mostly, actually. I think it's just those that are thoroughly irritated take to social media.
Okay.
I mean, that's the majority of cases. That is the feedback that's given. And to be brutally honest, if I got something that you can see straight through as being skirting around the edges, then I would deliver exactly that back, going, well, it's very clear you were one of two. I know exactly what's being said along the way. You've been unlucky there because it's a paper thin difference, and they picked you to it. So there's a lot of frustration around recruitment because recruitment is flawed, because it starts off where it does, and people are in a heightened sense of anxiety usually going through it. So when it doesn't work, they make more noise. Everybody that has a positive experience doesn't take to social media to go, I've just had a really nice experience. I got rejected, but it was handled very nicely. And even if you did do that, you wouldn't get 500 people commenting on it and keeping it at the top of your feed. So I think it's a disproportionate reaction that we see on social media, but it's real, it's not. Part of the reason I got into recruitment was I thought it could be done differently.
Yeah.
Because there are people out there that don't necessarily sort of have that concern for their populations, and so we do still see that happening. It's still out there, less and less.
So I've done a lot more recruitment in the last couple of years than I had planned, because there's 9 of us now, and one thing. So obviously learning a bit more about the recruitment process, and one of the things that I think I realized is that you really need to, to your earlier answer, there isn't a process that is the right one, because in some ways it probably needs to be personalized. And it was actually one of the things that the advice that you gave, because I came to you, I think last year, or maybe a couple of years ago, because we were looking at I was looking at an Excel test, to give to candidates, and I said, "Oh, have you seen one that is really good or works really well?" And you told me that it's always better to create your own that is
Yeah.
tailored to the sort of skills and things that you're looking for, and that's what I ended up doing, and that was really, really useful advice because, like you said, you sort of created it in the way that you might do things, or some of the things that you might look out for or appreciate from an analyst, for example. So, are there other things as well that you would suggest should be more personalized in the recruitment process, alongside, for example, like an Excel test that you've seen done really well by other recruitment or other companies? So, yeah, what would you recommend?
Uh, I think actually that Excel test is quite unique because everything else that goes through in terms of the recruitment process is more generic. I mean, people are put through psychometric tests quite regularly at the senior end. Sometimes they are taken as hugely important and as deciding factors. Other times it's just a backup process. I've known companies that seem to spend quite a lot of money on them, but just ignore them if they don't put out the answers they want. So the Excel test is testing something very, very raw and something they're going to be doing from day one. And as you suggest, if you make it look very much like something that you would have given that individual last month if they'd been on board, then that works. I don't think you can personalize the rest of it because really it's about the conversation. You know what you want, or you probably know what you want. You certainly know what you don't want in the individual, and that could be related to personality traits. It could be just style that you can't even articulate. But when you meet someone, you either click or you don't. I don't think there's any further personalization than having their version of their CV, probably their version of their LinkedIn profile, because 98% of people will have one. And then going through, I think you do need to ask similar questions of each candidate. I don't think if you have completely different conversations with these people, then you're not going to be able to compare like with like. Although you may, as is often documented, you may make your decision in those first 3 minutes, and then you sort of filling out 45 minutes of chat just to say, like, we're going through this, but fundamentally it's all yours. So I think more important is understanding or trying to understand what their motivations might be, what the job actually entails, and the deeper specific skill sets in those as they're evolving, like various new areas of reward that spring up. Or do we need that knowledge, or is it we need a nice guy who's driven here, who's interested, or we need someone who's more, one thing or the other? That I don't think that there's anything that can be so idiosyncratic as the exact test.
Okay. Are you seeing some, the way that we work has changed significantly since COVID? What are the trends that you're seeing, because you particularly focus on senior reward roles, around requirements to be in the office? And is it we want somebody who's going to be in the office full time? Is it we need a minimum requirement of 2 to 3 days? And how prevalent is it that some organizations are willing to allow complete remote working at senior levels?
I am yet to be instructed on a role that's fully remote, even through the COVID years. It's the expectation from the candidate side of things is that everyone's working hybridly, and that 2 to 3 days is about right. And that has been the case probably up until last year, when we just started, or I started to perceive that businesses were saying, yes, it's fine to have some time at home working, but we kind of like you in the office. It's had, I think you can draw industry lines on this, which is somewhat flies in the face of my previous comment about industries not being the right reason to decide for or against. But certain industries, certain slightly more traditional businesses are starting to pull people back to the office space. I mean, it's resisted. It's resisted quite heavily, particularly in the international space. I mean, there really is very little point if your whole team is spread throughout the globe and you spend your life on video calls anyway to do that. Yeah. It was quite interesting. I noticed quite a few candidates in the second half of last year coming to me to say, I live 80 miles away from my office and that's been fine for the last 2 years, but now I'm expected to be there at least 3 days a week. That's taking out masses of time in my week. It's costing me more money. There was never a contractual agreement to this, so I haven't got a leg to stand on if I'm saying, well, look, I need either some recompense for the additional cost and as a result looking to leave. The roles that I've been instructed on in the last 3 or 4 months, all bar one have been an expectation of 3 days in the office. And the other one is more significant than that, suggesting really that we kind of like people here. I think we're going to settle down on one business I worked with came up with a 50% rule, but given we've got 5 days in the week, that turned out to be 3 on, 2 off, 2 on, 3 on. I think that's probably quite a sensible thing. Everyone comes down to the same conclusion, which is we should be grown up about this. There are times in the year when you need to be here and you're doing long hours. Year-end stuff happens, and if you're trying to get out of that, then there's question marks. But everyone agrees that if you're delivering on your job, it doesn't really matter where you are. But delivering on your job to some degree is around team management, is around bringing together that sense of togetherness of being in the same organization, and that involves every now and then being in the same space. The willingness or the interest in working remotely is clearly driven by your stage in life and demographic. So where we went to one full extreme in COVID, I think we're coming back to a happy medium, but it's more office than remote. I think it.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that you haven't been instructed at all about a completely remote role, because, earlier you were talking about the recruitment process, feedback, and the issue around inclusion and things like pay gaps. And this is definitely something that I think, allowing some people remote work is part of that inclusion. And you're not realistically going to attract groups from different backgrounds if you don't offer that. And so I think this has big impact in the reward community, because it's things like, what sort of salary ranges do you use? Do you want if your office is in London and you need people to come in 3 days a week, is it a London-based salary, or is it a national remote working salary? What about somebody who's working remotely? And do you get a lot of those questions, or from candidates to say, I'm told that I need to come into the office. Am I going to be given a London rate? Am I going to get allowance for travel and so on? Or are these conversations they tend to have directly with the company?
Yeah, I think they're direct with the company. I mean, it's almost been decided by the time I'm talking to people. The candidates who I'm talking to, not about a specific role, will often say, well, if I'm coming into London, or if I'm going into Manchester, or if I'm working in Edinburgh, I need this. And if I'm able to work from home, I'm more flexible on the salary. But the businesses don't reflect that. It's not being shown as a sort of an either or. Organizations make their mind up, and it's then up to you as to whether you'll comply or be interested in what they have to offer. What has happened, and what is really positive, I think, is that the biggest positive that came out of all of this, the COVID stuff, was that we no longer it's no longer the sort of a suicide note to suggest that you want to work from home at any point. It's no longer the death knell. You're not basically removing yourself from a recruitment process by saying, every now and then I'd like to pick my kids up from school or do something that's not bury myself in your work. And it's not expected that if somebody's working from home on Monday, that actually what they're doing is laying in bed for 3 extra hours and watching daytime TV. We've proved that people are more trustworthy than we thought they were. And so to some degree, businesses have to come up with more inventive reasons as to why they want them in the office, because actually we trust each other now.
Yeah, it's a challenge that I had when I first set up, because I've always been, since I said I've been remote, as a team, we're remotely based as well. We meet up once a quarter. But in the beginning, when I would sometimes get a project and they'd say, everything's agreed. And then they would say, okay, so which days are you coming into the office? And I would say, well, why do you need me in the office? Don't you want this piece of work done?
Yeah.
And sometimes I'd lose the project because they just physically wanted you there. And that has definitely changed the mindset around that. So I think that's definitely a positive.
And it's going to move with the generations coming through. Those of us who started off with a strong sort of 9 to 4, well, 8 till 6 expectation, or even 8 till 8 at the early days, where it was just assumed that if you wanted to succeed, you just worked. That's no longer the mindset of whatever letter of the alphabet generation are now coming into the workforce. I've lost count. We're in Zs. But it's just not. That's just not how they operate, and it's not. It's a blink of an eye until they're running all these businesses, and so it's an evolutionary thing. It won't. It doesn't happen overnight. None of these things do. And I've still got candidates. I'm representing quite a few at the moment who are saying, I want to work a 4-day week, but I don't want to be paid at 80% because I'm not being paid for the length of time that I sit in an office. I'm being paid to do this job. Here's the spec, here's the deliverables, here's the team. I'm going to do all of that, but I'd like to do that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and not Friday. It works at points.
It's really interesting because not last month, the month before, our podcast was with one of the CEOs who ran the trial on the 4-day work week.
Oh, yes.
And I think it was something like 95% of companies continued with that after the trial.
It did.
It's one of those, I think it's a very difficult, it's a lot more difficult in practice because there's so many things to consider, particularly, if you are a small business and you're you're struggling to survive or grow, as opposed to a large profitable business, although I think it can be more complex in larger organizations as well, the 4-day work week.
I think it's really tough. I think it's almost, until the whole of global society agrees, it's going to be really difficult. Everyone seems to agree it's a 5-day week at the moment. Certain parts of the world have the different 5 days, but that's fine. It's still 5 days. I would personally, I've embraced it. I mean, I was working remotely before Zoom became a thing, and I thoroughly enjoy it, and I'm much more productive because I know I've got a day extra work because 2 hours a day isn't spent traveling. So at the end of the week, that's an extra 10 hours that I'm able to be productive, or indeed I'm able to, go and see my daughter in a play or watch my son throw himself in the mud on a rugby pitch. It's those, but I think those are very valuable things, and that sort of, is that well-being is, there's a lot of chat about making sure that we're not just working and working and working.
So I think, there's so many interesting insights here, and as we're coming towards the end, I think it would be interesting to think about the future and what's happening. And are there any trends or that you're seeing around AI being used in the recruitment process? And how do you think that AI is likely to change the role of the recruiter or the actual recruitment process in the next few years?
I'm singularly ill qualified to answer this question because I'm whatever the right term is, I'm not a technophobe. I absolutely love technology, but I just don't understand it. So I throw myself at it and get it wrong. AI is too complex for me to understand what it's going to actually do. But if I take it back to when LinkedIn appeared on the scene, I was recruiting already by that point. And there were loads of people were telling me, I had a friend of mine who was involved with LinkedIn saying, are you counting the days to when you're redundant? And at the time I thought, this is a proper challenge to us. What's the point of us if everyone can access this information so easily? Isn't this what we're paid for? Fundamentally, turned out that wasn't what we were being paid for. It was what we peddled. We used to bang on about the size of our database as being the thing. But as everyone in the business pointed out, we don't know the 120,000 people that are on the database. We can access them, but we don't know them. You couldn't possibly do that. And so that shift, all that happened is we slightly pivoted the way we operate and said, well, no, I don't have 100,000 on my database. I've got nigh on 4 billion or however many. And so do you. And good luck getting through it and getting them to respond to you. And so we became a slightly different, we actually enhanced our capabilities as recruiters. And I think it helped those that had deep relationships to sort of move to the top. AI is going to affect, I think it's going to affect our trust in each other first and foremost. I would be stunned if anyone writing their first CV now hasn't used AI to write it, because I probably would do that myself, and then hopefully tweak it. But you're going to find that it can undoubtedly be used to eventually potentially make every CV look and sound the same. My concern would be more its impact on the skills that reward people need. And if anything, it's, as with all technological advances, it's going to speed things up. It's going to take some of the necessary skills that we require at the moment away, but they're only going to be replaced by something else. I don't have any sort of existential concern that reward is going to be swallowed up by an algorithm. There are too many nuances to it. We're now dealing, I'd say that 50 years from now, you can point me back to this, if I'm not in my box, and say, you were wildly off. It's going to change how we operate. I don't think it's going to remove the requirement for us. Our role now, the reward people are now focused on so many areas that weren't even considered 20 years ago. We all started talking about well-being about 15 years back, but that was like, have we got a gym membership? That will probably do, rather than actually we have to look after these people, not just because it's good for business, but it's good for the soul. It's the right thing to do. You're seeing, all the chat around ESG and all the talk about, what are businesses focused on at the moment? It's new stuff. All the programs and benefits around support for women going through the menopause. You take us back 5 years and start telling reward directors that's going to be on their agenda, they would be stunned. But it's an obvious evolution, and that's continuing. All that space is, and I don't see that AI is going to have any impact on that. I think at junior level recruitment processes where we're not so interested in, or not yet as interested in, I guess, strategic thought of leadership skills and things, and it's more, to put it into the reward world. Can this person manipulate an Excel spreadsheet? Do they know what a VLOOKUP is? Can they do the very basic pivots? And then how far do they get? I'm sure there's an AI answer that can interrogate someone to that. But back to the point we were just making, you want that to be specific to you. So it might be you that says, rather than I'm going to devise this Excel sheet, you go, dear Mr. Chatbot, devise an Excel sheet that's good for my business. That might happen. I don't think we're going to find, which I guess is where you were coming from, so forgive me if I've got this wrong, but I don't think you're going to find that the first 3 rounds of interviews are going to be run by an algorithm, that they're going to sort of analyze people's social media history in order to make a decision as to whether this person is viable. Because if that's the case, we end up in the position we end up with in sort of in the political world, whereby if you've got a skeleton in your cupboard, you're absolutely gone. So the only people that can survive in public life are those that are not attached to public life. Not that sort of comment we hear in the media a lot of going, they're not in touch with the real person. You're thinking, well, if you've got a real person, they've probably got some photos in their social media feed that would bring them down in an instant. So, what do we want? And I think that's probably true of how recruitment will go. If you ended up just saying, we only want people who can do this, and let's just blitz everything that's available on them, and find out somewhere along the line they've done something or said something that they shouldn't, no one's ever going to get hired. So, I mean, I'm catastrophizing or exaggerating for effect, but I think AI will only be a positive force for speeding up little parts of what we do. But the days of a robotic interview process leading to an AI generated contract and a start date, I don't think it works. Humans still like humans. I think there's loads of space. I mean, Mr. Musk is going to do some wonderful stuff, I'm sure, or potentially some very strange stuff, but I don't think he's going to be able to completely remove human to human interaction. Well, at least not in our lifetimes.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I think, also with AI, there's an element of, it's not just, we don't just think about things and then AI comes up with a response. We have to give it a prompt. And I think there's also a lot of difference in the output that 2 different people can get from AI, based on what information you provide to them, what you ask for, how you ask for it. And I think there's a lot of training that probably will go in for people to learn how to use that and make the most of it, rather than removing people completely.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a danger with believing everything that AI puts out and following it, because it will then only believe its own stuff. And if it's made a mistake in year 1, by year 10, we're in all sorts of trouble.
Thanks a lot for all of your insights. That was really interesting.
You're welcome.
And I'm sure that everyone listening will have found that really useful. If anyone has any questions for Matt or for us to ask in our reflections episode, then please do email it across, podcast at acaseofthemondays.com. Thanks again, Matt. And I'm sure we will keep in touch, and I'll maybe come to you with questions if we're continue to looking to recruit more reward people at 3R.
Good stuff. Good talking to you.
Okay. Thanks, man.